Today I'm going to be making the Felix jacket. I'm doing the crop version and I'm using this beautiful Cantha fabric. I bought this I think on eBay and it came from India. It's absolutely beautiful. And because it's so lovely on the inside as well as the outside, I thought I would do Hong Kong bound seams, and to finish the edge I'm also going to use bias binding. Now you could actually buy your bias binding, but I like to make my own because then I can get a really good colour match. So making your own bias binding is super easy. Here I've got a piece of fabric and this is a 45-degree angle, so you've got the warp and the weft, and at exactly 45 degrees it becomes super stretchy, and that's your bias. So for my project I'm actually quite liking making the bias binding 5 centimeters wide, which I think is 2 inches off the top of my head. So I'm just going to measure across 5 centimeters twice and draw those 45-degree angle lines. And so they're on the true bias, so now I'm just going to cut those lengths. Making your own bias binding is so easy, and that way you know that you get a really good colour match. And a lot of bought bias binding is made from polycotton, which isn't very nice. So if you're wanting to have something special to go with special fabric, so for example my Cantha fabric, that wasn't cheap of course because that's all hand stitched. So I want to have a bias binding that really honours it. So I've got some frayed edges here, so I'm just going to trim those to make them nice and clean. So to join your bias binding, it's actually the straight grain, because this is the 45-degree angle and that is a straight line, which makes joining it really easy. So to sort of get your head around it, you want to have both of those lines matching, and then what you do is you put them together like so. Now actually I'll draw this line on. The stitching line can be essentially whatever you want. A centimetre is easy, so I'll just sort of roughly draw that on. So if you imagine I want to join my binding along that line, I don't want to match it edge to edge like that because my stitching will actually go off. What I want to do is overlap it so that my actual stitching line hits the edges of the fabric. So I'll just sew that so you can see what I'm talking about. Back tap at each end. Sew along your stitching line. So you can see I've gone from the actual cut edge to the cut edge so that when I open that out it is completely straight. Whereas if I'd sewn from tip to tip I'd have had an offset of whatever my seam allowance was. Now I'm just going to trim those edges, so back to about 3 millimeters, 4 millimeters, like that, and I'm going to press it and make it into my bias binding. So the first thing I'm going to do is press my little seam open. So just finger press by running my fingernail along the seam to get it open, and then I'm just going to use the iron with a bit of steam. I love steam, to give that a press. So that's going to be the wrong side of the bias because that's where the seam is. Next I'm going to just press this in half, so folding it over, and I'm not using any steam at this point because I just want this to be a really light fold. This is a beautiful bit of linen, so it's going to work really nicely. So just going along like that. I'm not stretching it. If anything, I'm kind of pushing it back on itself because bias binding is on a 45-degree angle. That is super stretchy and you could overstretch it. So we want to be really careful not to do that. So there we go. In half. Then we come back to the beginning and open it out, and we're going to fold in one edge, and we're going to just press this. So that cut edge is going towards the center, but not quite all the way. We're going to leave maybe 1 millimeter, a bit of steam. Like that. So you can see it's about 1 millimeter from the cut edge to the fold. And the reason for that is when we use the bias binding and we fold it over, it actually needs to have a little bit of room in there for the fabric. So you want to be quite careful not to get it too far or too close to that center. So there's the steam. Steam is great because it allows you to press and get a nice sharp edge without actually pushing too hard on the iron. Normally I use an industrial iron, and which is quite heavy as well, which is nice, and it has a really great steam action on it. But this one's better for the video. Okay, so that's folded in on one half. Then I come back to the beginning and do the same thing again, avoiding bringing that fold all the way to the center, so I've got a little gap. Part of the reason I like to do a 5 centimeter wide bias binding is that it does stretch, and so that just gives me a bit of a leeway. Especially with a slippery fabric like say silk, it means that if it's stretched out, then it actually will end up being a workable width. So there you can see it's folded in half. Now I'm going to fold that in half again, and because I left that little gap in the center, that means that all those layers are going to sit nice and flat. So some good bursts of steam here. And notice how I'm being really careful not to stretch it. If anything, I'm pushing it back towards the iron. So here is my bias binding complete, folded in half. It's nice and crisp, but I just want to show you with my ruler. See how that actually just measures slightly more than 1 centimeter. Now in theory, if I had divided my 5 centimeters into quarters, each one should have measured 1.25 millimeters, but that's what happens with that little bit of stretch. So that's why I like to go a little bit wider, and it gives me some room to play with. Now that I've prepared my bias binding, I've made myself a whole bunch here and just wrapped it onto some card to stop it from stretching and to keep it neat. I'm going to work on the front of this little jacket. So I have marked the apex of the dart on the inside, and on the side seams I've done some little snips just to see where the legs of the dart are. So what I like to do is fold the fabric in half, right sides together, matching those snips, and I pop a pin in, and then I fold the fabric over to where I've marked the apex of the dart, and I just sort of come down about halfway and just mark that and just make sure it's sitting nice and flat, and I'm just going to sew the dart. There you can see I've sewn off the edge, it's nice and sharp and ready to be pressed. So I'm just going to do the other side in the same way. Folding the fabric over, matching the notches. I sometimes just like to pop that under the machine to keep it in place, and then I can just sort of play around to get the fold in the correct place with the pin. Sewing along, and I'm sewing straight along the dart, not along the fabric. I'm not forcing the fabric to be in front of me, I'm letting it go on that angle so that when I sew off the edge of the dart, I'm getting a nice sharp angle on my seam. Right, I'm going to give that a little press. My darts are pressed, so I'm just going to put the front aside for a moment and I'm going to work on the pockets. So with the pockets you have options. You could either bind those edges, or you could overlock them. You could leave them raw if you're working with, say, boiled wool or felt. But in this instance, because I really like both sides of this material, I'm actually going to bag them out. So I'm just going to fold them over so that I've got the right side and the wrong side facing each other, which kind of messes with your head because we're so used to having to do right sides together. Like so. And I've got notches marked on here of where I'm going to stitch between, so I need to leave a little opening so that I can turn that through. My seam allowance is 1 centimetre, so I'm just going to sew around. This is quite stable fabric, I don't need to use any pins, they're only small pieces. But if your fabric was slippery or stretchy, you might want to use some pins. So back to the original notch, take it out and snip the threads. Now what I'm going to do is just trim the edge that I have sewn. So I'm taking that back down to about 2 millimeters because we want those curves around the edges to sit nice and flat. And then as I come around to where those notches are, I actually go wide again. So you can see I've left more seam allowance there, and that's so that when I turn it through, I've actually got enough seam allowance that I can play with to give it a good press and have it sitting nice and neat. So I'm going to push that through. And a little trick that I like to do is pop my scissors inside and just slide the tip around that seam, around the curve. I'm not sort of pushing it, I'm literally just sliding around the edge, and see how that's just coming out beautifully even before I have pressed it, like that. And there's the open bit, and then when I come to iron it, I'm just going to tuck in that seam allowance to give myself a nice clean pressed edge, and there I've got both sides showing. So I'm just going to sew the other side. Right, I'm going to give those two a press. I've pressed my pockets and I've pinned them into place on the front using my pattern as the guide for the pocket placement, and I've marked a pin at the points where I need to begin and end, and also just want to hold it in place. So I'm going to sew those on. I'm sewing right on the edge. trim those threads. Okay, so you can see I've sewn right on the edge. Now with some of these you can do different permutations. So for example, on one I just overlocked around a single layer for the pocket, and then I zigzagged the pocket on. With others I have actually bound the edges and then sewn them on. You could also blanket stitch the pocket on depending on your fabric choice. With these ones, because of that beautiful lining, I have designed it so that it is lined, and when it's folded over you can see the inside. But for some pockets I've actually got rid of that altogether and just cut off that diagonal and then put a bound edge as well. So really the options are unlimited with the pockets. Just think about what works with your fabric and let the fabric speak to you. Oh, and just a tip too, I leave that open because I know that I'm sewing it on, so that's actually going to sew that opening closed. I don't actually need to hand sew that closed and then sew that on. That's just doubling up. Okay, 2 pockets, and I'm just going to press them so that the flap is open. So there's the pocket pressed. It's nice and crisp, but if that was bouncing up a bit too, the other thing I could do is put a little button on there or something, fun little detail. The next thing I'm going to do is prepare my front and back for sewing them together. Now I want to do Hong Kong binding on these in most places, so I'm going to bind the side seams and the shoulder seams, and I'm going to do that on the front pieces and the back pieces. So I'm going to take some of my binding that I've made. I'm just going to trim the diagonal bits off so it's nice and flat. And if there's any kind of, you can see here with my dart, it's just a little bit out there. The fabric just stretched a smidge, so I'm just going to trim that so that it's nice and flat. If you had fabric that was fraying a lot, you could even overlock it first and then Hong Kong bind it. And just remember, this is an optional step doing the Hong Kong binding. You might prefer to just overlock your seams together or overlock them and have them open. I've done all different methods depending on the material that I was using. So I like to start off with a bit of an overlap because it gives my machine something to balance on, and then I can sew forward and start sewing. When you are sewing on your bias binding, if it's a little bit wider like this one that I've made, I can actually just do this in one pass. So I tuck the material into the fold, wrap the bias binding over, and I like to give the bias binding just a little pull so that it's sort of pre-stretched in a way, and just sew along like that. If you've never tried this method before, I suggest you give it a go. It's really easy, and you can see it works nicely. If you've got a really slippery fabric, it might be harder and you might prefer to do it in 2 passes. I'm going to do a technique called chaining on, so I'm going to take my next piece of the front on the side and I'm just going to keep sewing, wrapping that bias binding around that side seam. Back tacking at each end, and then what I can do is just cut through the tape, and then I'm going to do my shoulder seam, so I'm going to just tuck that in. Carry on sewing. And cut through that one and tuck my shoulder seam in and carry on sewing. I've come to the end of my tape here, so I'm just going to take that out and cut that off. and cut through there. And I'll just get another bit of bias binding to do the back section, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing, binding the side seams and the shoulder seams. Okay, I'm going to give those seams all a press so their binding is sitting nice and flat. I've bound all my seams and then I've trimmed the ends so that everything's nice and sharp, ready for the next stage. So what we're going to do is put the front pieces on top of the back pieces, lining up the side seams, and I'm just going to sew these together. Well, I'm not going to pin it. I feel confident that everything matches because I've made quite a few of these now. So I'm going, because my seam allowance is 1 centimetre and my bias binding is now 1 centimetre. If I show you with my little guide there, it's exactly 1 centimetre because I stretched it slightly as I was sewing it on. But if you found that your bias binding was slightly wider, it's actually okay. So long as all your seam allowances match, you'll be okay if it's just a couple of millimetres slightly bigger. So back tacking, and I'm lining up those edges of the side seam, and I'm just sewing right on the edge of the bias binding. Again, I'm chaining on, so I've got now my shoulders, matching them. Now sometimes when you sew the bias binding on, when you've sort of slightly pulled it, it can feel like the edges aren't quite matching, so you can just pull them back into place, just to stretch that bias binding again. Both shoulders done, side seam. Oh, I've run out of bobbin. Back in 5 seconds. Bobbin wound. Let's just finish this seam. And take that out. Okay, so now we can snip all those joins of chaining on. Trim the threads, and I'm just going to press this so that the seam is open. Now I'm ready to bind the edges of the neckline. So you want to start somewhere that's fairly discreet, and I find that the sort of the shoulder seam just towards the back is quite a nice place to start. Some people also like to just start down on the left hand side, on the side seam, around that sort of area, but I'm going to start with the neck. I just wanted to say, if you did want to do this in 2 passes, you would actually open out the bias binding, sewing it on the fold on the wrong side, and then folding it over and stitching on the right side. But again, I'm just going to do it in 1 pass because I've made my bias binding out of this linen, which is nice and stable. The Cantha fabric is nice and stable. There's no reason not to. If you needed to, you could trim these edges just to make sure that they're super flat wherever you've got a join, but they're all looking good, so I'm just going to go for it. So I'm starting just one edge of the neck. I'm just going to open out that binding, and I'm starting about 2.5 centimeters, an inch from the shoulder seam, wrapping that around the neckline. And then what I actually want to do is just sort of go slightly under, so sort of just pushing it a little bit more to the back, only by about 1 millimeter. It's almost nothing, but it just means that when I complete that join, because this is a complete loop around the whole neck, and front and back, it'll join nicely. So I'm just going to give that a slight pull on the bias binding, a little back tack, and sewing all the way around. So as I go, I'm really pushing that fabric into the bias binding. Probably the trickiest part is doing these curves. So what I do is I hold the fabric flat and sort of stretch the bias binding around so that it molds itself to that curve like so. And I think that's why I find this easier to do than one pass rather than the two. But you know, whatever works for you, there is no right or wrong way. And see, I'm just folding that around. And then I like to just slide my nail along, pushing it into that fold. You can see there, that's looking nice. Okay, I'm coming up to the end now. So what I want is an overlap. So I'm just going to, I want an overlap of 2 centimeters, and I'll just snip that because I'm going to fold back 1 centimeter, and then I want 1 centimeter overlap onto that neck. So you just might need to fiddle with it a little bit just to get it sitting nice and flat. Back tack and take it out, and you can see I've got this beautiful edge even before we have given that a press. Oops, beautiful edge before we've pressed it. So I'm going to give that a press now. Now that I've bound all the seams of my sleeves, I'm ready to sew the seams together. So, dog's going crazy. I'm just going to sew along the edge of the bias binding like I did on the side seams. Sewing along the sleeves until I get to the notch at the cuff. So if you're doing the version with the cuffs like I am, you need to stop sewing at the cuffs and take that out like so. So we're leaving an opening, and then we flip it over, and I'm going to start sewing from where that opening is. Now if you wanted, you could also have overlocked these sleeves and then sewn them together. You don't have to do the binding by any means, and you might find that perhaps that makes it a bit thicker, and so you want to avoid it. The next stage is to snip to the stitching line that you did. So very carefully cut to that stitching line. You do not want to cut through it. Like that. And then you're going to turn the sleeve through to the right side, and you're going to pull that seam from your sleeves out, and we're going to sew that down on the right side. and that's because we're having the cuffs turning back and we don't want to have any of that seam showing. This just makes for a really nice, neat edge. And on the other side. So you've got those sewn, and then just open this out so you can see I've stitched it on the right side, and then that will be pressed open, and then when the cuff comes up we've got a beautiful clean edge and it's concealed on the inside as well. So I'm just going to do the other sleeve. Okay, so that's my sleeves done, and I'm just going to give them a press. To complete the sleeve, I like to bind the edge before I set it in. So you've got two sides to the two-piece sleeve. You've got the short seam and you've got the long seam. So the long seam sits towards the back of the body. So I like to start the binding around the cuff from that point. So we're just going to sew it in the round. I'm going to start slightly to the side of the seam because otherwise it would be quite bulky, wrapping the binding around, and I'm just going to sew that on, just stretching that binding just a little bit as I go. Stretching the binding helps it just, I think, sit a little bit more snugly. Make sure that you open out the seams as well as you go past them. When you get close to completing that round, just like with the neckline, you want to have a 2 centimetre overlap so that you can turn back a centimetre of seam allowance and overlap the join. So that you've got the join, the binding, and then when you turn that up 4 centimetres, you've got your lovely cuff. And especially with this cantha, with the reverse side being so beautiful, I love having that cuff because then you get to see the other side of the fabric as well. But if you wanted to, you could do it without a cuff and just bind an edge and have it straight. You could shorten the sleeve and have it like a 3/4 sleeve, whatever suits you. So I'm going to do the other sleeve and then they'll be ready for a press. Okay, that's done. I'm going to give it a press. Now we're ready to set in the sleeves. So the way I like to do it is I open out the jacket. So I've got the right side in front of me with the side seam facing me. Then I take the sleeve that's corresponding. So just remember the long seam goes towards the back. And then I match the sleeve with the underarm notch of the sleeve with the side seam of the body of the jacket, and I just pop a pin in. Then I bring the jacket over and I put a pin at the point of the sleeve head and the shoulder seam, And those are the only pins that I use because I find it much easier to set in a sleeve head if I have less pins. So I'm going to start just to the side of the underarm seam, and then I'm just going to sew around, just feeling to make sure that the underarm seam is staying flat. And the bottom part of the sleeve under the arm sits quite flat, and then as you come up, you sort of can ease the sleeve in. It doesn't need a lot of easing, okay, so which is why you don't need to do any stitches or have pins in there. And as you can see, actually that pin fell out, but I don't need it anyway. I've got my notch showing me where that shoulder seam is. So what I like to do is, you can even use an unpicker as you go here, and you just sort of push the head of the sleeve towards the foot without actually gathering or creating any tucks. And just make sure that your shoulder seam is nice and open. I find the unpicker is a fantastic tool for that. It just helps keep it really flat, because what you're getting is sort of on the top of the sleeve head, that is a greater measurement than the actual stitching line. So you want to have like a little folds almost sort of on the other side of the stitching line, but not at the actual stitching line, if that makes sense. Hopefully I can zoom this in so you can really see what I'm doing. So just using my unpicker to push that sleeve head towards the foot. And then as I come around, I can see it just sort of snapping into place in the underarm seam. So I finish that seam off, coming around, over sewing by a centimetre and taking it out. And you can see it's that easy to set in the sleeve. So if I show you here, can you see how there's the kind of like the puckers on that edge, but they're not puckering on the seam line? And that's because that measurement there is greater than that, but it's also, which gives you the nice roll over the shoulder. When we turn that to the right side, you can see already how beautifully that is sitting, and no puckers on the seam. So I'm going to do the other side. Okay, and there's the other sleeve done. So I'm actually going to overlock this seam, because if I was to bind it, it would be kind of bulky, and I just really don't like how that feels under my arm, so that's getting an overlock. Now I just want to tell you how I press the sleeves. I like to use a tailor's ham. This is a homemade one. You can get free patterns for these online, and you just fill them with sawdust. If you don't have sawdust at home, you could perhaps go to a men's shed and get some from there, or go into Marketplace or something just to find something to fill your ham with. So I put it on its side like this, and then I slide the jacket shoulder over the ham, pushing the seam allowance towards the sleeve. This is an unlined jacket, so I find that I like that, and in fact I did do a lined one, and I still pushed it that way because I like how it sits. Now that isn't a rule of thumb, you can do it in the other direction as well. I think maybe it's because of the shape of my shoulders or something, I just find that it sits better. And so just using bursts of steam, you can mould that sleeve head over the ham, like so. And then you get this really nice roll over the shoulder. I mean, if you wanted to, you could put a shoulder pad in there. My shoulders are very straight, so I can't wear shoulder pads. And I just find that that works really well. So there's my jacket, all done. Time to try it on. So here is my Felix jacket all made. So it's got this beautiful bound edge. It's unlined so that with this Cantha fabric you can see the lining as well, and Hong Kong seams. I'm wearing it with an Eva tee and my Hannah culottes. So I love this jacket. It's got the option of having a turned up cuff. There's different pocket styles that you can have. This one is a lined pocket so that you can see the nice lining of the Cantha material. I think it looks so cute with the culottes in this sort of bolero length, but you can have it mid-length and long as well. So if you make one, don't forget, tag me at Pattern Union, #Felix Jacket, because I just love seeing customer projects as well.